Condon soon became very popular. The steamship companies gave him free passage to travel around the state, preaching on the wonders of science.
Thomas Condon was obviously a very talented communicator. He was able to get very complicated ideas through to the public in a way that they really enjoyed listening to him.
He gave the very popular lectures, and this was a time in American history where great men of science made a living traveling around expounding.
A settler who has no formal training at all would understand the marvels of some of the things that he was discovering out here in the John Day Basin.
He brought the fossils that he had collected, the jawbones and the skulls and the teeth and all of those things, and he would illustrate his lecture by using those very real artifacts that people could look at and understand what he was talking about.
Some of the most important specimens that were instrumental in proving Darwinian evolution, we see that Thomas Condon's name is often listed as the collector.
Thomas Condon felt lucky to receive a copy of Charles Darwin's book maybe 10 years after it was written. He was already thinking about evolution, and Darwin had what he considered to be proof.
My great-grandmother was a fairly fundamentalist in her religious beliefs, and Condon was considered by many, especially the Methodists, to be a bit of a heretic.
He believed it was God's plan to create life gradually.
For him, it was very obvious that evolution and descent from a common origin was something that was painted clearly in what he referred to as the great textbook of life.
Wherever he traveled, Condon ended up debating the merits of evolution with his fellow ministers.
God did not create the whole continent in a single act, as man once believed, but through the use of natural agencies. God did not stop to create a single fact. He created a vast system of facts.
For him, there was no conflict. It was a simple matter of if this is the way God chose to express himself, so be it. He wasn't going to argue with it on the basis of some theological argument that said, well, this can't be.
It would have been so easy for him to, as many people do today, to just say the church is closed-minded, the teachings of the church are closed-minded, modern science explains everything, therefore I just turn my back on religion and walk away.
Instead of giving up, Condon founded the First Congregational Church of Eugene, which continues to practice Condon's progressive brand of Christianity that values scientific inquiry and fought for women's rights 30 years before the suffrage movement.
Everyday life of the church would be overseen by 3 trustees in the beginning, and the bylaw language says at least one of whom shall always be a woman. That may not sound very radical to us in 2008, but I think that in 1889, that was a very radical concept. And that's what made him so extraordinary, because often religion then, as it does now, is about actually making life narrower, having our field of vision become less, putting people into boxes, and that Thomas Condon would have found that just extraordinarily wrong and unnatural.
Many years ago, I wrote a play about Thomas Condon, a one-man show. We started out working right from the beginning with Dr. Robert Clark, who had been president of the university and was an expert on Condon. Condon was his passion, his study in his retirement years. After we did the show, he wrote a very detailed biography of Condon. We didn't have that book to work with writing the play, but we had Dr. Clark himself, so he was a living resource right there for us.
In the early 90s, Condon was portrayed by veteran character actor Vernon Barkhurst.
I was doing volunteer work at the Museum of Natural History, and I was also doing a lot of acting. You want to read this in character? The doctrine of theistic evolution, the doctrine that declares evolution to be God's process of creation, is now taught by all the higher colleges of our country. Princeton University, Yale, Professor Packard, Brown University, and many colleges of lesser note.
An Evening with Thomas Condon brought to life one of Condon's lectures. He'd even toured the state, as Condon had done 100 years earlier. As the state of Oregon grew, Condon recognized the need for a state university to educate young Oregonians.
The role that Condon played in placing the university here in Eugene, the sort of anonymous letters that he wrote to the newspapers that chided the people of the Lane County area and actually got them to raise the funds that were necessary to build that first building here.
When the University of Oregon opened in 1876, Condon was named the first professor of geology.
His fellow professors at the university, when he was one of the first 3 professors, looked down on him a little bit for not being a trained professor. He was trained as a theologian, and he was a self-trained geologist, and he was so good at it and so renowned nationally that it was logical to hire him as a professor of geology. They couldn't get anybody better in the whole state of Oregon.
Condon was taking the students into the field to read the real textbook, as he referred to it, and being called in by the president and told that he had an obligation as a professor to keep those kids in the classroom, to which he grudgingly acquiesced, and as Clark put it, fortunately it was the beginning of winter term and the rainy season, and it was a lot easier to spend the time indoors, and by springtime when the weather turned good, he figured that the issue was largely forgotten, and he took them back outside again where they could learn. He
was completely open to having girls in the class. You know, science, those days they thought, oh, girls shouldn't study science, it's too rough and raw for, you know, they should just be studying poetry. But he encouraged women to study as much as the men and to do experiments and, you know, get in the lab and do things. So, yeah, I think he felt that everyone should have an equal opportunity.
Years later, the university would name a building after him to commemorate his years of devotion to scientific discovery and education. In this way, the name Condon is remembered by the thousands of students who have attended the university over the last century.
Matter of fact, one of my first classes here at the university was in Condon Hall. So I'd been to the Condon collection, which was upstairs in the top floor of Condon Hall at that time. So I knew about Thomas Condon in that sense.
After more than 20 years of teaching, Thomas and Cornelia bought a vacation house at the Oregon coast. Condon would stroll along the beach, admiring the geological wonders of the coastline. As he walked, a crowd of townspeople would follow close behind him. He would stop and teach about nature from his vast stores of scientific knowledge. But his legendary beach lectures became less and less frequent, as old age and failing health eventually began to keep him indoors.
This is right at the end of the play, and Dr. Condon is summing up his life. I looked into the mirror this morning and saw an old graybeard staring back at me. 84 years old. That's not old, but I am old. I have the memory of the earliest life forms within my cells. I am a trilobite, an oreodont, a dinosaur, a mammoth. I am man, created according to primordial plan. I am millions of years old and I am newly born, a babe in the cosmic scheme. We are all crawling infants with only a glimmering of future knowledge, future evolution. When I meet my Maker, I shall thank him for his constant and infinite creativity. No single thing abides, but all things flow. Fragment to fragment clings, the things thus grow. until we know them and name them. By degrees they melt and are no more the things we know.
On February 13, 1907, Thomas Condon was laid to rest in the Eugene Masonic Cemetery. The American Journal of Geology wrote that though Thomas Condon was little known to the scientific community in the East, he did a considerable service to geology.
He was a naturally humble man. He felt that God took him wherever he could serve mankind.
So I was going through lines and everything, and Horace was, "Stop for just a minute," you know, and we were yelling back and forth to each other, and the janitor walked through, and he went into the office and he said, "Why are those two men shouting at each other?" So that was a kind of a memorable occasion.
Thomas Condon built this bench back in the days before they had steel and welding equipment. How did he do it? It remains a mystery. Sorry, you guys are trying to be serious, and all you need is a smart-ass paleontologist.